Still reading through our manual. Still not done part 1, chapter 1. In short, she would have made a perfect wife for such a nobleman as Orlando. And matters had gone so far that the lord on both sides were busy with covenant jointures, settlements, messuages, tenements, and whatever needed before one great fortune can mate with another when, with the suddenness and severity that had marked the English climate, came the Great Frost. The Great Frost was, historians tell us, the most severe that has ever visited these islands. Birds froze in mid-air and fell like stones to the ground. At Norwich, a young countrywoman started across the road in her usual robust health and was seen by the onlookers to turn visibly to powder and be blown in a puff of dust over the roofs as the icy blast struck her at the street corner. The mortality among sheep and cattle was enormous. Corpses froze and could not be drawn from the sheets. It was no uncommon sight to come upon a whole herd of swine frozen immovable upon the road. The fields were full of shepherds, plowmen, teams of horses, and little bird-scaring boys all stark in the act of the moment. One with its hand to his nose, another with the bottle to his lips, a third with a stone raised to throw at the ravens who sat, as it stuck, upon the heads within a yard of him. The severity of the frost was so extraordinary that a kind of petrification sometimes ensued, and it was commonly supposed that the great increase of rocks in some parts of Derbyshire was due to no eruption, for there was none, but to the solidification of unfortunate wayfarers who had been turned literally to stone where they stood. The church could give little help in the matter, and though some landowners had these relics blessed, the most part preferred to use them either as landmarks, scratching posts for sheep, or when the form of a stone allowed, drinking trough for cattle, which purposes they serve admirably for the most part to this day. But round the country people suffered the extremity of want, and the trade of the country was at a standstill. London enjoyed a carnival of the utmost brilliancy. The court was at Greenwich, and the new king seized the opportunity that his coronation gave him to curry favor with the citizens. He directed that the river, which was frozen to the depth of 20 feet and more for 6 or 7 miles on either side, should be swept, decorated, and given all the semblance of a park or pleasure ground, with arbors, mazes, alleys, drinking booths, etc., at his expense, for himself with the courtiers. He reserved a certain space immediately opposite the palace gates, which, railed from the public only by a silken rope, became at once the center of the most brilliant society in England. Great statesmen, in their beards and ruffs, dispatched a fair state under the crimson awning of the royal pagoda. pagoda. Soldiers planned the conquest of the Moor and the downfall of the Turk in striped arbors surmounted by plumes of ostrich feathers. Admirals strolled up and down the narrow pathways, glass in hand, sweeping the horizon and selling stories of the Northwest Passage and the Spanish Armada. Lovers dallied upon divans spread with sables. Frozen roses fell in showers when the queen and her ladies walked abroad. Colored balloons hovered motionless in the air. Here and there burst masked bonfires of cedar and oak wood, lavishly salted, so that the flames were a green, orange, and purple fire. But however fiercely they burnt, the heat was not enough to melt the ice which, though the singular transparency was yet of the hardness of steel, so clear indeed was it that there could be seen, congealed at a depth of several feet, here a porpoise, there a flounder. Shoals of eel lay motionless in a trance, but whether their state was one of death or merely of suspended animation, with the warmth would revive, puzzled at the philosophers. Near London Bridge, where the river had frozen to the depth of some 20 fathoms, a wrecked, weary boat was plainly visible, lying on the bed of the river where it had sunk by its hull, overladen with apples. The old bumboat woman who was carrying her fruit to market in the Surrey side, sat there in her plaid and farthingales, with her lap full of apples, for all the world as if she were about to serve the customer, though certain blueness about the lips hinted the truth. It was a sight King James specially liked to look upon, and he would bring a troop of courtiers to gaze with him. In short, nothing could exceed the brilliance and gaiety of the scene by day. But it was at night that the carnival was at its merriest, for the frost continued unbroken. The nights were for perfect stillness. The moon and stars blazed with the hard fixity of diamonds, and to the fine music of flute and trumpets the courtier danced. Orlando, it is true, was none of those who tread lightly the Coronto and La Volta. He was clumsy and a little absent-minded. He much preferred the plain dancing of his old country, which he danced as a child to these fantastic foreign measures. He had indeed just brought his feet together from 6 in the evening of the 7th of January at the finish of some white quadrille, or some such quadrille, or minuet, when he beheld, coming from the pavilion of the Muscovite embassy, a figure, which, whether boy's or woman's, for the loose tunic and trousers of the Russian fashion served to disguise the sex, filled him with the highest curiosity. The person, whatever the name or sex, was about middle height, very slenderly fashioned and dressed entirely in oyster-colored velvet, trimmed with some unfamiliar greenish-colored fur. But these details were obscured by the extraordinary seductiveness which issued from the whole person. Images, metaphors of the most extreme and extravagant twined and twisted in his mind. He called for a melon, a pineapple, an olive tree, an emerald, and a fox on the snow, all in the space of 3 seconds. He did not know whether he had heard her, tasted her, seen her, or all three together. For though he must, this time, for though he must pause not a moment in the narrative, we may here hastily note that all his images at this time were simply in the extreme to match his senses and were mostly taken from things he had liked to taste of as a boy. But if his senses were simply, they were at the same time extremely short. To pause therefore and seek the reason of things is out of the question. A melon, an emerald, a fox in the snow. So he raged. So he started. When the boy, for at last a boy it must be, no woman could skate with such speed and vigorous, swept almost on tiptoe past him. Orlando was ready to tear his hair with the vexation that the person was of his own sex, and thus all embraces were out of the question. But the skater came closer. Legs, hands, carriage were a boy's, but no boy ever had a mouth like that. No boy had those breasts. No boy had eyes which looked as if they had been fished from the bottom of the sea. Finally, coming to a stop and sweeping a courtesy with the utmost grace to the king, who was shuffling past on the arm of some lord in waiting, the unknown skater stumbled to a standstill, who was not a heart's breadth off. She was a woman. Orlando stared, trembled, turned hot, turned cold, longed to hurl himself through the summer air, to crush acorn beneath his feet, to toss his arm with the beech trees and the oaks. As it was, he drew his lips up over his small white teeth, opened them perhaps half as an inch, as if to bite, shut them as if he had bitten. The lady, their first son, hung upon his arm. The stranger's name he found was the Princess Moros Stanilovska Dagmar Natasha Ilyana Verminovich, and she had come in the train of the Muscovite ambassador, who was her uncle perhaps, or perhaps her father, to attend the coronation. Very little was known of the Muscovites. In their great beards and furred hats they sat almost silent, drinking some black liquid which they spat out now and then upon the ice. None spoke English, and French, with which some at least were familiar, was then little spoken at the English court. It was through this accident that Orlando and the princess became acquainted. They were seated opposite each other at the great table spread under a huge awning for the entertainment of the notables. The princess was placed between two young lords, one Lord Francis Vere and the other the young Earl of Moray. It was laughable to see the predicament she soon had them in, for though both were fine lads in their way, the babe unborn had as much knowledge of the French tongue as they had. When all beginning of dinner and when at the beginning of dinner the princess turned to the earl and said, with a great wit ravished his heart, Je crois avoir fait la connaissance d'un gentilhomme que vous était apparent, espérons de este dernier, or la bertha des dames de la cour de Angleterre me met dans le ravissement. On ne peut voir une dame plus gracieuse que votre reine, ni une coiffure plus belle que la sienne. Both Lord Francis and the Earl showed the highest embarrassment. I did not expect so much French. No one helped her largely to horseradish sauce. The the one helped her largely to horseradish sauce. The other whistled to his dog and made him bend for a mirror bird. At this, Princess could no longer contain her laughter, and Orlando, casting her eyes across the bird's head and stopped the peacock, laughed too. He laughed, but the laugh in his lips froze in wonder. Whom had he loved? What had he loved? He asked himself in a tumult of emotion until now. An old woman, he answered, all skin and bone, red-cheeked tulls, too many to mention. A puling nun, a hard-bitten, cruel-mouthed adventuress, a nodding knots of latent ceremony. Love had meant to him nothing but sawdust and cinders. The joys he had had of it tasted insipid in the extreme. He marveled how he could have gone through with it without yawning. For as he looked the thickness of his blood melted, the ice turned to wine in his veins. He heard the waters flowing and the birds singing. Spring broke over the hard wintry landscape. His manhood woke. He grasped the sword in his hand. He charged a more daring foe than whole or more. He died in deep water. He he saw the flower of danger flowing in a crevice. He stretched his hand. In fact, he was rattling off one of his most impassioned sonnets when the princess addressed him. Would you have the goodness to pass the salt? He blushed deeply. With all the pleasure in the world, madam, he replied, speaking French with a perfect accent. For heaven he prayed. He broke the tongue as his own. His mother's maid had taught him. Yet perhaps it would have been better for him had he never learned that tongue, never answered that voice, never followed the light of those eyes. The princess continued. Who were those bumpkins, she asked him, who sat beside her with the manager's stableman. What was the nauseating mixture they had poured on her plate? Did the dogs eat at the same table with the men in England? With that figure of fun at the end of the table with her hair rigged up like maypole? Come una grande percha mal spaghetti. Really, the queen? And did the king always slobber like that? And which of those popinjays was George Villiers? Though these questions rather discomposed Orlando at first, they were put in such harshness and drollery that he could not help but laugh. And he saw from the blank faces of the company that nobody understood a word. He answered her as freely as she asked him, speaking as he did, in perfect French. Thus began an intimacy between the two which soon became the scandal of the court. Soon it was observed Orlando paid the Muscovite far more attention than mere civility demanded. He was seldom far from her side, and their conversation, though unintelligible to the rest, was carried on with such imitation, provoked such blushes and laughter, that the dullest could guess the subject. Moreover, the change in Orlando himself was extraordinary. Nobody had ever seen him so animated. In one night he had thrown off his boyish clumsiness. He was changed from a sulky stripling who could not enter a lady's room without sweeping half the ornaments from the table to a nobleman, full of grace and manly courtesy. To see him hand the Muscovite, as she was called, to her sledge, or offer her his hand for a dance, or catch the spotted kerchief which she had let drop, or discharge any other of his manifold those manifold duties which the supreme lady exacts, and the lover hastens to anticipate as a sight to kindle the dull eyes of age, and to make the quick pulse of youth beat faster. Yet over it all hung a cloud. The old men shrugged their shoulders, the young tittered between their fingers. All knew that Orlando was betrothed to another, the Lady Margaret O'Brien O'Dare O'Reilly Tyrconnel, for that was the proper name of Euphrosyne of the Suns. Wore Orlando's splendid sapphire on the second finger of her left hand. It was she who had the supreme right to his attentions. Yet she might drop all the handkerchiefs in her wardrobe, of which she had many scores, upon the ice, and Orlando never stopped to pick them up, so might wait 20 minutes for him to hand her her sledge, and in the end have to be content with the services of her blackamoor. 25 minutes in. When she skated, which she did rather clumsily, no one was at her elbow to encourage her, and if she fell, which she did rather heavily, no one raised her to her feet and dusted the snow from her petticoat. Although she was naturally phlegmatic, slow to her offense, and more reluctant than most people to believe that a mere foreigner could oust her from Orlando's affections. Still, even the Lady Margaret herself was brought at last to the subject that something was brewing against her peace of mind. Indeed, as the days passed, Orlando took less and less care to hide his feelings. Making some excuse or other, he could leave the company as soon as they had dined, or steal away from the skaters who were forming sets for a quadrille. Next moment it could be seen that the Muscovite was missing too. But what must outrage the court and strung it in its tenderest part, which is its vanity, but that the couple was often seen to slip under the silken rope, which railed off the royal enclosure from the public part of the river to disappear among the crowd of common people. For suddenly the princess would stamp her foot and cry, "Take me away! I detest your English mob," by which she meant the English court itself. She could stand it no longer. It was full of prying old women, she said, who stared in at one's face, and of bumptious young men who trod on one's toes. They smelt bad. Their dogs ran between her legs. It was like being in a cage. In Russia, they had rivers 10 miles broad in which one can gallop 6 horses abreast all day long without meeting a soul. Besides, she wanted to see the tower and the beef eaters, the heads in the temple bar, and the jewelers' shops in the city. Thus it came about that Orlando took her into the city, showed her the beef-eaters and the rebels' heads, and brought her whatever took her fancy in the royal exchange. But this was not enough. Each increasingly desired the other's company and privacy all day long, where there were none to marvel or disdain. Instead of taking the road to London, therefore, they turned the other way about, and were soon beyond the crowd among the frozen reaches of the Thames where, save for seabirds and some old country woman hacking at the ice in a vain attempt to draw a pailful of water, or gathering what sticks or dead leaves she could find for firing. Not a living soul ever came their way. The poor kept closely to their cottages, and the better sort, who could afford it, crowded for warmth and merriment to the city. Hence Orlando and Sasha, as he called her for short, and because it was the name of a white Russian fox he had had as a boy, a creature soft as snow but with teeth of steel, which bit him so savagely that his father had it killed. Hence they had the river to themselves. Hot with skating and with love, they would throw themselves down in both solitary reach, where the yellow osiers fringed the bank, and wrapped in a great fur cloak Orlando would take her in his arms, and know for the first time he murmured the delight of love. Then When the ecstasy was over and they lay lulled in a swoon in the ice, he could tell her of his other loves, and how compared with her they had been of wood, of sackcloth, and of cinders. And laughing at his vehemence, she would turn once more in his arms and give him, for love's sake, one more embrace, and then they would marvel that the ice did not melt with their heat, and pity the poor old woman who had no such natural means of thawing it, but must hack at it with the chopper of cold steel. And when wrapped in their sables, they were talk of everything under the sun, of sights and travels, of moor and pagan, of this man's her beard and that woman's skin, of a rat that fed from her hand at table, or the arras that moved always in the hold of home, of a face, of a feather. Nothing was too small for such converse, nothing was too great. Then suddenly Orlando would fall into one of his moods of melancholy. The sight of the old woman hobbling over the ice might be the cause of it, or nothing, and would fling himself face downward on the ice and look into the frozen water and think of death. For the philosopher in which who says that nothing thicker than a night's blaze separates happiness from melancholy, and he goes on to opine that one is twin fellow to the other, and draws from this the conclusion that all extremes of feeling are applied to madness, and so bids us some refuge in the true church. In his view, the Anabaptist, which is the only harbor, port, anchorage, etc., he said, for those tossed on the sea. All ends in death, Orlando would say, sitting upright, his face clouded with gloom. For that was for for that was the way his mind worked now, in violent seesaws from life to death, stopping at nothing in between, so that the biographer must not stop either, but must fly as fast as he can and to keep pace with the unthinking, passionate, foolish actions and sudden extravagant words in which it is impossible to deny Orlando at the time of his life indulged. All ends in death, Orlando would say, sitting upright on the ice. But Sasha, who after all had no English blood in her, but was from Russia, where the sunsets were longer, the dawns less sudden, and sentences often left unfinished from doubts as to how best to end them. Sasha stared at him, perhaps sneered at him, for he must have seemed a child to her, and said nothing. But at length the ice grew cold beneath them, which she disliked, so pulled him to his feet again. She talked so enchantingly, so wittily, so wisely, but unfortunately always in French, which notoriously loses its flavor in translation, that he forgot the frozen waters, or night not coming, or the old woman, or whatever it was, and would try to tell her, plunging and splashing among a thousand images which had gone as stale as the woman who inspired them, what she was like. Woman cream, marbles, cherries, alabaster, golden wire, nothing of these. She was like a fox, or an olive tree, like the waves of the sea when you look down upon them from a height, like an emerald, like the sun on a green hill which is yet cloudy, like nothing he had seen or known in England. Ransacked the language as he might, words failed him. He wanted another landscape, another and another tongue. English was too frank, too candid, too honeyed a speech for Sasha. For in all she said, however open she seemed and voluptuous, there was something hidden. In all she did, however daring, there was something concealed. So the green flame seems hidden in the emerald, or the sun prisoned in a pill. The clearness was only outward. Within was a wandering flame. It came, it went. She never shone with the steady beam of an English moon. Here, however, transports and swept her over the ice, faster, faster, vowing that could he would chase the flame, die for the gem, and so on and so on, the words coming in the pant of his breath, with the passion of a poet whose poetry is half pressed out of him by pain. But Sasha was silent. When Orlando had done telling her that she was a fox, an Alistair, or a green hilltop, he had given her the whole history of his family. How their house was one of the most ancient in Britain, how they had come from Rome with the Caesars and had the right to walk down the Corso, which was the chief street in Rome, under the tasseled palanquin which he had in a privilege reserved only for those of imperial blood, for there was an orgulous credulity about him which was pleasant enough. He would pause and ask her, where was her own house? What was her father? Had she brothers? Why was she here alone with her uncle? Then, somehow, though she answered readily enough, an awkwardness would come between them. He suspected at first that her rank was not as high as she would like, or that she was ashamed of the savage ways of her people. For he had heard that the women in Muscovy wear beards and the men are covered with fur from the waist down, that both sexes are smeared with tallow to keep the cold out, tear meat with their fingers, and live in huts where an English noble would scuffle keep its cattle, so that he forebode to press her. But on reflection, he concluded that her silence could not be for that reason. She herself was entirely free from hair and the chin. She dressed in velvet and pearls, and her manners were certainly not those of a woman bred in a cattle shed. This is such a long chapter. I still have there's still 17 chapters until 17 paragraphs until chapter 2.